All right, you're going to take some notes on the Victorian period, and the reason you're going to take notes over that is because Dracula was written towards the end of the Victorian period, and many of the pieces of literature that we read in class are from the Victorian period or influenced by it. And it's also an important part of history that you need to know. Now, I'm not going to go into as much detail as you need to know for history, but you just need to be aware that the historical period impacts the literary world. All right, some general information about this time period. Huge change occurred in political and social life in England and the rest of the world. So this was one of those times in history that a huge impact, and it happened quickly. It was a time of scientific and technological innovations during the Industrial Revolution. So technology, like we think of it, is your smartphone, your iPad, whatever, but you have to remember is technology is anything that's developed that makes life easier or makes life move more quickly, things like that. So technology back then was the development of factories and all those things that helped create the Industrial Revolution. So we see, because of that, an emergence of nationalism. So these countries are taking pride in themselves, and they're expanding their religious views and their trade across the world. And so we start to see the development of colonization in Africa and the Middle East and the Far East, and eventually all over the world. Far-reaching new ideas help create this outpouring of literary production, which is just a fancy way of saying people started writing more and they were published more. So the reason they were published more is because paper became cheap during this time period because it could be mass produced in a factory. And so we see tons of magazines and novels come out, and the literacy rate grew. People started being able to read, not just the rich people, but people of all walks of life and economic standings. So we see a huge growth in novels, poetry, and that kind of thing. That's why this is an important period. It's a time of change. Some of this I'm going to go over really quickly. London becomes the most important city in Europe, and the population expands from 2 million to 6 million. And the reason for this is because we've got all this development of huge factories. We need people to work them. So people started moving from the rural landscape and their farms into the big cities. So we start seeing this first development of a modern urban economy. We see an impact on industrialism, both positive and negative. There's an increase of wealth, and with that increase of wealth also comes an increase of poverty, because the people who work in the factories are working under harsh conditions, they're not paid well, and we start seeing that development of the haves and have-not. England becomes a huge imperial power through colonization, and because of the Industrial Revolution, Victorian people started feeling this sense of anxiety because they're being displaced. They felt they were becoming displaced people in this age of technological advances, because the advances and the industrialization happened so quickly, they were not equipped to deal with it. In many ways, there's some parallels in what's happening in our world with our technological advances. Queen Victoria is the queen during this time period, and she ruled from 1837 to 1901, and she exemplifies everything Victorian. That seriousness, which means earnestness is seriousness, moral responsibility, proper manners, domestic propriety. People expected women to act a specific way, and there was no improper talk anywhere at any time. It was also an age of transition, so this was a time of change from the old culture into the new contemporary world, partly what you know today. And most importantly, we see this high moral purpose. High morals were important during the time period. So, characteristics of Victorian literature: earnest sense of responsibility, very serious sense of responsibility. Authors thought they could change the way life was. There is an occasional lapse of taste. Remember that high moral standards were the norm during this time, but authors would comment or have their lapse of taste in terms of trying to get things past the women and the small children who may have been listening to the book read, but the dads or the men would get the jokes. There was an overflowing of creative energy, and the goal is to represent nature. So these authors really wanted books to come across as reality. So they have detailed realism in these novels. We see the literature influenced by the Puritan code. They did not want to offend young girls, so they avoided those subjects. And finally, the late century broke free of this restriction. And you're going to see this in Dracula. It's still kind of subversive, but Dracula has a lot of undertones of things that weren't appropriate for young girls. And Bram Stoker hides some of those things, but he also has them up front. So we will talk about those when you read the book. The literature was to guide and to teach readers. They often used it as a teaching platform. Writers were independent, and so they did literary experiments just to explore new means. And they were evangelical in nature. You see a lot of religious overtones in some of these because of the sense of reform. Some attack social conditions. Again, I'm going to bring up Charles Dickens, attacks social conditions. And there was external conformity and social responsibility. Internally, that may not be true. Poets were concerned with man's relationship with God, and the novelists were concerned with man's relationship with man. So that's where we see the reform. So we see a lot of books about concerning people in society. I'm not going to read all these to you. You can write them down. You see that these things are things that you would see in the Victorian era. Some of them are still important to us today. The content of the novels, what you saw happening in many of these novels. So we saw conflict between people in power with the common masses, because we've got this concern with the haves, the factory owners, and the have-nots, the laborers in the factories. They revealed the shocking life of the sweatshops, the factory life, how the urban poor barely survived. We see a lot of realism in those areas. The country life versus the city life, because people moved into the city. We see novels about sexual discretion, or on the other hand, the lack of it. Lady Chatterley's Lover was one of those that had the lack of it written during this time period. There's strained coincidences, and you're going to see that in Dracula. Romantic triangles in these novels. You'll see kind of a form of that in Dracula. Heroines in physical danger. Oh, there's Dracula again. Aristocratic villains. Oh, there's Dracula again. Misdirected letters and bigamous marriages. The novel becomes popular for the first time because it's mass-produced. We see our Bildungsroman, which are coming-of-age novels. This is where we start seeing the first of those. Charles Dickens, huge Bildungsroman author. We see political novels, detective novels. We see the Sherlock Holmes books coming along. And serialized novels. I already talked about those and how they were produced in periodicals. We see a lot of elegies, which are poems that honor the dead or people who have recently died. Poetry becomes easier to understand, and we see the development of the dramatic monologue. And we'll read a dramatic monologue, My Last Duchess. And it's basically a dramatic monologue, put this in your notes for future use, is we have a speaker that's talking to an unknown person and just telling a story, sort of just rambling on in the poetic form. And of course we have magazines, I already talked about that offer the stories to the general population. Talked about realism, important part of Victorian literature. Realism, put this in your notes, make sure you get it, is an attempt to produce in art and literature an accurate portrayal of reality. So there's detailed descriptions of everyday life. We see the good and bad of it, not just the good side. The period before this, the Romantics were only looking at the kind of the ideal side of life. Themes include dealing with families, religion, and social reform, because those were things that were important during this time period. We also are going to see naturalism, which is a form of realism. And naturalism is based on the philosophical theory that actions and events are the results not of human intentions, but of largely uncontrollable external forces. You are going to see this in Dracula. Authors choose subjects and themes common to the lower and middle classes. And their audience is poor people, not just the aristocracy. So everyone can read, and the huge number of their population were lower and middle classes, so they could write for them now. Naturalists are very attentive to details and try to be very accurate and authentic in their descriptions.